Our next guest on the line is Andre Carrington. Andre, welcome. How are you today? Are you
Thank
with
you.
us?
I'm all right.
Great.
Yes, I am.
So just a little bit about you. Andre's research focuses on the cultural politics of race, gender, and genre in 20th century American literature and the arts. He has a book called Through a Lens Darkly Blackness in Speculative Fiction and Media. And he is also on the board of directors at the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies. He is currently a professor at Drexel University. He's assistant professor of Department of English and Philosophy. Andre, thank you so much for joining Midday Briefing today. We have a national conversation again about race erupting, very similar to what occurred around Trayvon Martin. Love to get your thoughts on where we are with what's occurring in Ferguson.
Thank you. This is sadly too reminiscent of what happened to Trayvon Martin in Florida. What's particularly reminiscent of it at this stage is that the person who killed Mike Brown, an innocent, unarmed black teenager, has not been prosecuted. That person's identity is not a matter of public record yet, but what we have seen is that the identities of people who were involved in looting have been made public. People who have been trying to report on what's going on have been arrested, and the person who killed Mike Brown has not been arrested. So the similarity that we see between this situation and so many instances of violence against the most marginalized people in black communities in America is that the police are protecting themselves instead of protecting and serving the citizens.
And, you know, we just recently last month had a father who was killed by a chokehold in New York City. So if you go on YouTube and look for cases of police brutality, there's legions of them. What do you believe is the genesis of this problem, particularly in inner city black communities and Hispanic communities, and the disparate treatment that we often see between how white Americans are treated and black and Latino Americans are treated?
I think it's really good to recognize that those things are related. I think it's the Malcolm X grassroots movement, a national coalition of community organizations, that has pointed out that it's something like every 28 hours in the United States, a black person is shot and or killed by police or security personnel who are armed. And this is just really a tragic and epidemic situation. I think a connection with what happened to Eric Garner, what happened to Rekia Boyd, what happened just recently to Ezell Ford in Los Angeles.
Now, when you say these names, a lot of people may not know who we're talking about. So Eric Garner was the father who was killed by a chokehold. But tell us about the other two cases.
Ezell Ford was an, again, unarmed 25-year-old black American man who was shot and killed by an LAPD police officer on August 11th. And the other individual I mentioned, Rekia Boyd, was a young woman who was killed a number of years ago by police.
And so, and this is not a new problem. I mean, you go all the way back to the 60s. The issue of police brutality was the genesis in many ways for the Black Panther Party that emerged, you know, a militant group that believed in self-defense. And then you had, you know, fast forward to Rodney King. And then that incident caught on tape sparked again national outrage and rebellions or unrest around the country in inner cities. And now we see this happening in Ferguson. What is the answer? What is the solution to creating better relationships between law enforcement and minority communities?
It seems essential that law enforcement agencies trust the people in the communities they're policing. We're seeing that has not been happening in Ferguson, Missouri, not just recently, but for a number of years. We have seen this just recently with the death of someone in Los Angeles, and we saw that was what was happening with Rodney King so many years ago. And when we saw back in the 1960s, black communities occasionally defending themselves against the police and occasionally being killed by police in the course of the civil rights movement, even when many of them, the majority of them, were nonviolent actors, what they were protesting and advocating for was an honest and accountable relationship with the law enforcement agencies and with the government and their community agencies in the society of which they're citizens.
But how do you make that happen? How do you create that trust and that accountability? I know that there's been calls in the past for civilian review boards. Right now, we have a lot of pressure on the police in Ferguson, who are under criticism for the way they've been responding to the demonstrations there. And so we see this play out time and time again. How do you put the systems in place and the mechanisms in place to create the kind of trust and accountability that you're talking about?
The first and essential immediate step is that even though police forces like those in Ferguson are using less lethal weapons, they need to use weapons less in general, because any weapon can be lethal. So even though we're seeing them take a military posture, and fortunately they're not using live ammunition, they're using less lethal weapons so indiscriminately that the emphasis has to be on the fact that they're using weapons to approach their relationship with members of their community instead of relationships. The other thing that we could really change is something that has worked in many communities, has been having police officers wear cameras on their uniforms so that their conduct is recorded. Dashboard cameras in police cars often also serve the same purpose of just making available to the police force themselves, to the local communities, and to civilian review boards where they're in place, records of what it is the police are doing. And those civilian review boards need to have things like subpoena power, they need to be independent from the police department, and they need to be democratically accountable and representative of the communities they're in, just like the police forces need to be.
And in Ferguson, as this investigation unfolds, we heard President Obama earlier today in some unfiltered audio here on Midday Briefing, which is what we like to bring to you. We heard him talk about the need for an investigation that was transparent and accountable. What, as far as you know, is going on with that investigation, and what would that look like?
I don't think we have a full sense of what the Department of Justice and the FBI are doing at this point to investigate the killing of Mike Brown. We do know that the Department of Justice has been in discussion with the police chief in Ferguson, and I think with Governor Jay Nixon, and that's constructive. But we don't know if the investigation is proceeding. And one of the ways that we know we don't have all the information that we would like to see, as the president said, the transparency we'd like to see, is that we have not been alerted that the person who shot Mike Brown has been taken into custody, that he's going to be indicted. Regardless of what his identity is, the issue is that whoever he is, he has not been arrested and charged with the crime, and we have not been advised, as we were in New York when Eric Garner was killed, that the investigation was being treated as a homicide. If we start to hear those things, whether it comes from the FBI or from state authorities in Missouri or from another level more locally, then I think we can trust that this cooperation between the federal and local authorities is proceeding the way that people are hoping for.
Well, it's interesting because in Trayvon Martin, even though the shooting was not by a police officer, it was the fact that the perpetrator was not arrested and not charged that sparked the national outrage around the country that eventually led to...
Exactly.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. You know, very quickly, kind of a related issue is that, you know, law enforcement is the first contact for many young African-American and Latino men with, you know, or police are with the criminal justice system. That's their first contact. And we see disproportionate numbers of African Americans and Hispanics, particularly young men, in jail. We know that they are arrested, African Americans, at 10 times the rate, arrested and incarcerated for nonviolent drug offenses than whites, even though usage is the same. So I'm wondering about, do you see a correlation between the police activity and what we're seeing in terms of potential police violations of people's civil rights and the mass incarceration we see in this country? We incarcerate more people than any other country in the world, even China, which is interesting.
We definitely see that correlation. And two things that show that we could really change that in drastic ways are that we would not have such less than representative police forces and governments at every level if people in communities that are disproportionately convicted of crimes, even if they commit them at the same rate, did not have their things like voting rights taken away or their eligibility for federal financial aid taken away. If those barriers didn't stand in the way of their opportunities to participate in democratic governance and pursue jobs in whatever fields they might want to and have the aptitude to, we wouldn't see institutions like the education system, the police forces, our local, state, and our federal governments be less representative and accountable to the communities where these disproportionately policed populations live in.
Well, Professor Andre Carrington, great conversation, fascinating thoughts, really enjoyed your insights. Thank you so much for joining us.